My name is Bob Bengtson. We are very pleased and proud to have Laura Belanger with us today, for she is a terrific organist, and her program, as will soon be reflected, is a very varied one. As an organist myself, I'm particularly looking forward to the Mendelssohn, not having heard it for some time. Laura's background and experience are by all measures significant. A graduate of the Manhattan School of Music, she studied with Frederick Swann, who for much of his career was organist of the Riverside Church in New York City. Currently, Laura is organist of the Sanbornton Congregational Church and accompanist for the Pemigewasset Choral Society. Having come to know Laura the past few years and transcending all of the above, I would describe her as a really good egg, for whom there is a great deal of genuine affection, as is evidenced by the presence of many of you today. Please join me in welcoming Laura Belanger.
Good afternoon. I think when my time to go comes, I think I'll have Bob do my eulogy for me. It's very stirring. Yes, I have a very varied program today. This is when you think about trying to design a program, you think, well, what am I going to do? And this was one of those programs where I said, gee, I always wanted to learn this piece, but I never got around to it. Well, I finally got around to it, and that's what a lot of this program is, are pieces that I really love and have always wanted to do, and so now is my opportunity. I hope you like them as much as I do. The very first piece, the introduction in Toccata in G major by William Wayland, it's a Baroque style piece. It's not in the style of Bach. It's more in the style of Handel. Wayland was an organist, apprenticed organist, spent most of his time at Oxford University. He was one of the very first to get a degree at Oxford. This particular piece is typical of organ music of that time. It starts with a very slow, solemn introduction, and then it goes into a movement, and in the words of E. Power Biggs, the great organist E. Power Biggs, to be played with spirit and vigor. The introduction in Toccata in G major. The next piece on the program, is by Mendelssohn. This is what Bob has been looking forward to, I guess. Interestingly enough, the organ is a unique instrument in that mostly there are organ composers, usually not very famous composers. The famous composers just don't write for the organ, typically. When you think of Beethoven or Brahms or Mozart, they never really wrote much for the organ. It is a unique instrument. Sometimes it's hard to compose for instruments that are unusual. So, but Mendelssohn was different. Mendelssohn was a mainstream composer, wrote in all different styles, all different instrumentations, and he wrote well for the organ. And of course, it stands that he was the one who basically resurrected Bach, who had fallen into disuse or disfavor after he died. But Mendelssohn did. He did the first performance of the St. Matthew Passion in many, many years, and Bach, of course, still remains as one of the great composers and done often today. But it's amazing that Mendelssohn was a mainstream composer who wrote well for the organ. He was an organist himself. These sonatas are not your typical sonatas that you would find like Beethoven wrote or Mozart wrote. They're almost more like suites. The one that I'm playing is the Sixth Sonata. It is based on a chorale tune. You'll hear the chorale tune first in a very solemn presentation, and then it's followed by three variations. They're all somewhat solemn, and then the very last variation, which I consider a second movement, is the Allegro. It's kind of a grand toccata with the chorale melody in the pedal, and then it gradually goes into the hands too. At one point, the chorale melody is right in the middle of my hands as I'm playing the toccata. Thank you, Mendelssohn. But he doesn't end it there. He follows it up with a fugue. That's the third movement. And then he ends it very, very quietly with a lovely little movement based on just a very small fragment of the last phrase of the chorale. Now, the next piece is by an organist, Alfred Hollins. I don't know how many of you have heard of Alfred Hollins. He was I would say, mostly turn-of-the-century organist and pianist, English, blind at birth. He was raised by his aunt, who realized his musical talents early on and sent him to a school for the blind where he was able to excel at both learning the piano and the organ. I believe he was, at a very young age, he played the Emperor Concerto for Queen Victoria. He had quite an amazing recital career throughout the world. He logged something like 600,000 miles worldwide, which I think is just amazing, especially at that time for somebody who was blind. It just amazes me with people with those kinds of disabilities to be able to do things like that. This is probably one of his most famous works, the Trumpet Minuet. There's another very famous work of his called The Song of Sunshine, which sounds like a happy-go-lucky piece. But as is this one too, the Trumpet Minuet. It's one of those kinds of pieces that's very much in the classic and romantic tradition. If you have something, a theme that's really good, you repeat it again and again and again. So if you really like this theme, you'll love this piece. If not, it's your time to check your email. So. Ain't that a fun piece? The next work, this Reverie, was written by a friend of mine, Godfrey Tomanek. We became friends, he in his later life. He was a gentleman who came to this country at a very young age before the Depression, to the Midwest. I think he was 6 years old when he came here, and then when the Depression came along, his family decided to go back to Europe. And then with the Nazi occupations, his family came back here. So he eventually settled in eastern Connecticut and became an organist and choir director of note in that area. I think he was organist and music director at the cathedral in Norwich for a little while. And he always would send me music. I tried to see him as much as I could, but I couldn't always get down there, and as time went on, I wasn't able to see him, and then he passed away in 2015, sadly. And unfortunately, I didn't look at a lot of his music until after he died, and this was one such piece. And it's, I think it's just a wonderful piece. It's very introspective, very, very quiet, very sweet piece. I hope you enjoy it. last piece on the program, the Alleluias, is by Simon Preston. For those of you who are organ aficionados in the 60s and the 70s, when I was a youngster, Simon Preston was the quintessential English musician, English organist, great recitalist. He didn't write a lot of music, but this was one piece, and it's quite a mainstay of the organ repertoire. It's a fiery one, so fasten your seatbelts.